Good afternoon, everybody. Uneducated Economist here. So it seems the rumors of another stimulus package being handed out are now flying through the mainstream media. And what I find interesting when I read through some of these articles is that they are trying to sell this stimulus package as some sort of support for low-income wage earners, like the low-income families, to be able to provide them with, some extra money to go out and buy necessities or pay the bills or whatever. It's there to support the low-income families. But the reality of the situation is they're trying to stimulate aggregate demand. See, now there was a time in which that the Federal Reserve would try and stimulate aggregate demand, which is you and me going out there and spending money into the economy. The way that they would try and stimulate this aggregate demand was the lowering of interest rates. So the Federal Reserve would drop their Fed funds rate around 5%. This overnight lending rate within the big banks would then start moving into the general public, the markets out there, and we would be able to buy houses and cars and go on vacation much more affordably when the interest rates were to come down. And this is the way that they were able to stimulate the economy, is the lower interest rates, and then we, the people, would borrow the money and go out there and spend it into the economy. However, since the great financial crisis, the stimulating of the economy through the lowering of interest rates is no longer an effective tool for the Federal Reserve. So if it comes to recessionary pressures that are happening out there and they want to try and stimulate the aggregate demand by lowering interest rates, doesn't work. It simply just does not stimulate the economy like it once had. And the main reason for that is that we are debt saturated. So even if they were to lower interest rates by a significant amount, like right now they have the Fed funds rate at just below 5%, even if they were to take them all the way to zero, it would not be enough to stimulate the economy, because the people themselves, even if they had opportunity to take out lesser interest rate loans, they cannot do it because they are already saturated with the loans that they have taken out, whether it's student loans, car loans, credit card loans, house loans. They're already at the very end of their limit. They cannot take on any more debt. And now this is the problem that the banking system and the government faces as they try to deal with recessionary pressures. They cannot drop the interest rates and then get the people to go out there and spend that money. So instead, what ends up happening is the lowering of interest rates that doesn't stimulate the economy then gives the ability for the government to borrow the money and literally hand it over to us. And then we go out there and spend it. And this is really how they are able to stimulate the economy now, is through stimulus packages, because the lowering of rates is no longer the effective tool. Now, it's not an effective tool anymore since the great financial crisis because of something called the neutral interest rate. Now, I'm not going to get too deep into this, but to understand that the neutral interest rate is when the Federal Reserve, the central banking system of the United States, is neither accommodating nor restricting the economy. The interest rate is neutral. The problem with this is this neutral interest rate is very close to zero. So even if the Federal Reserve was to take the Fed funds rate and drop it all the way to zero, getting far enough below the neutral interest rate to actually stimulate the economy is not the effective tool that it once was previous to the great financial crisis. So going back to the early 80s, when the Fed had the Fed funds rate up around 15%, this gave them a lot of room to stimulate the economy. They would just lower interest rates. People will go out there, borrow money to buy houses and cars and go on vacation. And this was an awesome way of dealing with the economy, especially considering we are a consumer-based economy. We're not a production-based economy like we once were. See, that's also important to understand, is that there was a time we would get new money in through the production, through our manufacturing. We would produce all the world's greatest stuff, send it out there to the world. The world would send us their money. This is how we got new money in. But the United States doesn't operate in this fashion anymore. Producing enough stuff to send out there to the world to get new money in is no longer the effective strategy, since we no longer produce the stuff that we consume. Like, we produce a lot of stuff, but we don't produce enough. We import a hell of a lot more stuff than we export. And when we import stuff, we export money. And that's the problem that we are now facing, is that how do we stimulate the economy if you can no longer lower interest rates to get the consumer to go out there and spend the money? Because we now produce a consumer. And producing a consumer by lowering interest rates doesn't get the consumer to go out there and borrow the money to buy the houses and the cars and the stuff that we import from all over the world. Then the government has to borrow the money and literally hand it to us. And that's how they are able to produce a consumer. So when it comes to these stimulus packages, or the idea of getting stimulus packages in, is not one of good economic conditions. That is so important to understand. It's not there to support the low wage income earners or the low income households or anything like that. What it is there to do is to try and get you to go out there and spend the money to increase aggregate demand. Because here in the United States, being a consumer-based economy, if the people are not out there spending that money, we are going to have a slowdown in our economy through the recessionary pressures that come from less people borrowing money and spending it into the economy. If they don't do it, the government has to. And this is really where we're facing the major problems here within the United States, is how do you maintain the production of a consumer without bringing in new money? You always have to bring in new money, because the moment that you don't bring in new money, the consumer starts to fade away. And if the United States is trying to produce a consumer, they cannot have the aggregate demand falling due to the fact that people are not borrowing the money. So if they are not going to borrow it, the government is. And the government comes out with these stimulus packages and say, hey, this is here to help the poor people out there. But really what they want you to do is to go out there and spend all that money on anything that you really would normally spend your money on anyhow, because they are trying to produce a consumer. It's very important to understand it in this fashion, because when you think about UBI, most of the time when you hear about these case studies of UBI, they're like, oh no, look, we did this test of UBI to show how awesome it is to have a UBI type of system taking place. Now, those of you who don't know what UBI is, it stands for Universal Basic Income. And the idea behind it is that the government literally hands us money every single month that we get to go and spend out there on whatever we want. And the idea is that it's going to take care of our necessities in life, to cover the toothpaste, the toilet paper, a little bit of food, pay the bills, whatever it is. This universal basic income is there to support the low wage income earners, to kind of equalize the playing field, I think, is kind of like a way of looking at it. The problem with this is most of the time when they do these studies, what they do is they take a select group of people, draw a circle around them, and give them a particular. That's called segregation. It's segregated basic income. When you take a group of people and say, hey, we're going to give this select group of people a particular, and that particular is that they're going to get a bunch of money, and then we're going to compare them to a bunch of people who didn't get money. And we're going to show how awesome it is that these people who got the money did comparatively to the people who didn't get the money. Well, no kidding. You don't think that the people who got the money, that little select group of people that you drew a circle around and gave a particular to, you don't think that those people are going to do so much better than the people who didn't get it? I mean, this is kind of like a dumb test to do, because universal basic income means everybody gets it. And if everybody gets this money and they all spend it into the economy in the same fashion that they always have done, what they are going to do is create supply-demand imbalances, prices move up, and the UBI doesn't do anything to relieve the pressure that is upon these people who are low-wage income earners. What it does is stimulate the economy in the fact that it will raise aggregate demand. And by raising aggregate demand, you are essentially producing a consumer. And that's what the United States is doing. They are producing a consumer. And so we have to understand that what it is that they are attempting to do, because it's not there to support the people. When people say this, it's this check is coming in to support me so that I can do better with my life and have the chances to buy a house and car and be able to, live the life and pay the bills and all this other stuff. Consider this, that if everybody has that same universal basic income, they are all going to go out and buy the exact same thing that you were buying or that they had always purchased. And what it's going to do is create the supply-demand imbalances, which then increase inflation and then causes your UBI check, your universal basic income, to be less effective within the economy. But what it does do is increases that aggregate demand, by getting the people to go out there and spend that money and buy all the stuff that they normally had. If you are not going to go out there and borrow money through credit card or mortgage or car loans or something of that nature, you're not going to be able to stimulate aggregate demand, because you're debt saturated. You're loaded up with student loans. You've already got a house payment. You got credit card payment. All this stuff is keeping you from being able to go out there and borrow money to then spend into the economy. And because you can't do it, they will. So this universal basic income and the idea of stimulus packages to support the low-income wage earners is completely false. Because you don't take out debt to go and spend into the economy, the government is going to do it and then literally hand you the money so that you go out there and spend that. And this is important to understand because people are going to look and argue it all kinds of other ways. But we have to understand that they are desperate to figure out a way to increase aggregate demand. Remember that. Like, they are trying to figure out a way for you to go out there and spend money. It's not a production saving nation like we once were. See, there was a time when they would say, hey, go out there and produce all kinds of wonderful stuff, get the money and save that money. Now they're like, don't save that money. You got to spend that money. You got to spend that money into the economy because we are a consumer-based economy that has to have ever-increasing amounts of stuff coming in and us selling that stuff to each other in order for there to be an economy. We just don't exist like we once were, where we were the production nation. So not being a production nation means that we have to produce something here, and what we produce is that consumer. And that's where the stimulus packages come in. That's what the UBI comes in. You know, like, you think about it, every time there's recessionary pressures within this economy and within this nation, this is actually a good thing taking place. When you have a recession happening, you got malinvestment that is being bankrupted, going into default. This is getting rid of the zombie corporations, getting rid of the bad debt. It's incredibly painful, and the people hate it because they lose their job, they lose the ability to pay the bills, they have this feeling of pain and anxiety that rips across them, that they then demand the government to do something about it. And since the government can no longer be in a position that says, hey, you can go out there and borrow cheaper money, if that's not available to them, then they're just going to have to say, hey, we're just going to go borrow the money ourselves and we're just going to hand it to you. And the people are going to praise them for it. But we have to understand what is really taking place here is the government's trying to figure out how to produce a consumer. All right, uneducated economist, you guys let me know.